this is going to be my riff in the direction of the feminine and the masculine. I was talking to my wife about this a lot. Like she's amazing, and she's done an enormous amount of work of actually really doing what we would call here in Encinitas embodying the feminine. And how did it work? So it was something like, this call. All right. So I have actually a lot of conversations with people one-on-one,
Mm-hmm.
and it's roughly half and half, men and women.
Mm-hmm.
But none of the women are willing to permit it to be recorded. Mm-hmm. And some of the men are, like in this one. This is going to be recorded, and I hope that at the end we'll publish it. I think there's a value in this being shared. And of course, I'm going to honor that. Right. And by the way, if you said, "Hey, I don't want this published," then it won't be published.
Yeah.
But none of the women want it published.
Mm.
And she said something really, unfortunately, she said it so well that I don't even want to. I don't want to dishonor it by saying it poorly. But it was more or less along the lines of course. Right. This is something that doesn't want or need to be poked and prodded at by other people's attention. There's something about the sacredness of it that actually needs to be held with care and closeness, something like that. Like that's not right, but it's sort of gesturing in the direction. You'd have to ask her to get the exact right words.
I'll ask her.
But how does this work? All right, so let's take a couple. I'm going to pick a bunch of swings at this because I think it's super important. All right, so one swing. You ever read the poem Ozymandias by Percy Shelley?
Just bits.
No, all right. Well, it's not very long, so I recommend reading it right now. It's just short. The gist of it is this: classic Indiana Jones style guys like walking across the desert, comes across two objects just sitting in otherwise just wasteland sand.
Mm-hmm.
One is this face, like a giant head of a statue, clearly that had fallen long ago, that has like a kingly aspect to it. And the other is the pedestal with 2 feet and some words, and presumably in a language long lost, but he happens to be able to translate. Mm-hmm. And the plaque says something like, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Behold the glory of my kingdom and despair.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, the point is, it all turns to sand. Right. It all turns to dust. All kingdoms will return to dust. Right? Okay. Now hold that. All right, 2. I'm going to do this in a really kind of a poetic way. So I'm going to loop around. I want it to land it in an odd way. All right, so 2 is, with the invention of writing, certain characteristics of humanity were upregulated, other characteristics were downregulated. Those characteristics that could be transmitted via dead text, like accounting, suddenly had this characteristic of outliving their moment by a long time. Mm-hmm. Right? You could actually read a text that was written about a story, for example, a story of Osiris 500 years ago. Mm-hmm. Right? It sort of has this new shift. Specifically, it has a characteristic of being somehow transcending human life. It transcends life and death. It has an immortality aspect to it.
Yeah.
And those characteristics that aren't that kind of thing, like a woman's experience of childbirth, very, very difficult to convey, particularly in hieroglyphs, don't have that same upregulation. Right? So I would propose that one big piece of the historical shift of the relationality between the masculine and the feminine, and by the way, the male and the female, and the men and women, which aren't exactly the same, right, was in fact the introduction of writing. Right? Mm-hmm. And you'll notice, I don't know if you know, but the historically, almost always it was the case that the earliest literate were boys, and usually trained quite painfully. Mm-hmm. And of course, the content of most early writing were things like formal laws, contracts and agreements, and accounting ledgers. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the stories of the royal family. This person did this to that. Like those kinds of things are early content of writing.
Yeah.
Okay. Next piece. Part of this gives rise to the sense of or yearning for what I would call immortality, which is funny because it ain't immortality. It's just living longer than you happen to live. Mm-hmm. So I'm familiar with the notion that Julius Caesar lived. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so from the point of view of my own very brief existence on this planet, part of my egoic self, in particular, has oh man, I would like to be as well known as Julius Caesar. Wouldn't it be amazing if people 1,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now knew my name? And to the degree to which, by the way, you are saturated in history, you're saturated in the things that can be transmitted via writing, via non-imminent in the Forrest Landry sense, not right here, right now relationality, but can in fact be artifacted into some substrate that carries on for a long period of time, you may have a sense of being able to live past your own death. And so to the degree to which you have a fear of death, then you will have an attraction towards this artifact of immortality, right? Which then makes you want to be famous, right? Because the only way to really have immortality is to be famous, right? You want your name and identity. Your identity can become famous, not yourself. Your rich, nuanced reality of who you are in your deepest sense cannot be captured by the mediated artifacting of writing or whatever else, right? As we all know, even a really, really good biography is a minuscule snapshot of the reality of the life of the person, minuscule, infinitesimal. But some aspect of your identity can be rendered somewhat immortal, right? But of course, Ozymandias, right? Whatever immortality you have is subtended on the civilization infrastructure that is carrying that story forward, and that will also end, right? There is no infinite year Reich to which you can become the great leader and therefore have your name carried forward with it. And by the way, that is exactly the energy right there. Like that imperial energy is the energy of immortality of that sort.
Yes.
So now I return back to my wife. I return back to my interlocutors who say, what I'm talking about is a little bit too subtle. It's a little bit too nuanced. It's too, needs more care than is appropriate being broadcast out to the attention of the world. And said, you know what? That's probably the healthiest possible way to be. Remember that phrase, like well-behaved women rarely make history? What I would propose is that the right answer to that phrase is, and that's a really good fucking thing, because yearning to make history is the building blocks of tyranny. Live a meaningful life, die with an absolute certainty that the only recollection of your having existed at all will be carried by your friends and family, right? And when they die, it will fade, it will fade, it will fade, right? Live so that other people after you can live, but do not endeavor even an iota to carry more of the future to yourself, actually embodied in the livingness of those who continue to live past you. That is a demoralizing blow to the egoic structures that dominate the current reality. That's probably the most painful pill that I would propose as part of the transition that I've been proposing.
Let me try to put something on that. I think that's super critical. But I think, it's something that I struggled with a lot, this attempt to be concerned. It's something that is already there when you have this concern for the future of humanity. And if your mind is there a lot, because what you're thinking about is how can I do something that has an effect on that future? And so there's this tension between the self-questioning, am I doing this for those egoic reasons so that I can leave my mark, so that you can know my name, my face, my handprint? And I think that's always a danger, and we always must be watchful for that. On the other hand, I'm not, and I don't think you are, and I think most of us are not ready to let go of this. Well, we still want to have that effect, whether it's as minimal as let's make sure we don't leave a mess for the next generation, or as more developed as let's leave a garden for them in some sort of way, in many different ways. So the task, and this becomes more difficult when we get into the realms of ideas and words and us as word makers, and idea, same thing. And how do we create the conceptual or linguistic technology that will be needed for the future of humanity in a way that doesn't tie it to an individual?
All right, that was an interesting thing to throw in there. Intense.
And I think for us, that becomes a task of for me, still being committed to that construction project, design project, but trying to figure out how to build that game in a way that's either anonymous or made anonymous through the ecstatic convergence of multiple voices, right? You know.
Yeah. Nice.
So
Nice.
that we can show our faces, and because I think there's some downsides to the anonymity part.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
But
for sure.
by getting enough of us together, we can create a product that doesn't belong to any of us, right?
Yeah, great. Holy smokes, let's see. No, this is you reached the point where that I was wanting to bring back in. So,
and the masculine and feminine maintain their balance.
So you've got a story where, on the one hand, there's the way of endeavoring to the way of how do people go about making choices such that they are trying to make the world a better place. Let's just make that, I'll say it like in a simple way. Okay? And it does seem like there's basically two paths, going back to our 2-year-old. Right? There's the path of the exterior, the path of the, what was the phrase? It was the opposite of autonomic.
Allonomic?
Yeah, allonomic, right? So there's the allonomic path and there's the autonomic path. The autonomic path is the one that you just ended with, I think, but there's a perfect continuity there. Right? If I follow the autonomic path, then one of the things that I notice is that I am also connected with things that are much larger than me, of which could be this multiplicity. In fact, is this multiplicity and all the multiplicities. And there's if I simply do, that's such a funny thing to say. If I simply do what is right, then I will intrinsically support the ongoingness, the health and the nutrition of the world in which I live. Now, of course, simply doing what is right is that ain't simple. but if other people in the past have said things like natural law, right? And that has a weird feel, I think, in many cases, but it's a little bit like, if I drop a rock, it falls is natural law, but there's a lot more to it, right? There's geometric, to use the term that I used, the way I used it earlier, there are characteristics of the nature of reality that if I hew to those characteristic natures of reality, and I notice, for example, this just is a simple one. You and I, have this very interesting shared characteristic, which is that we are the heirs to something along the lines of like billions of years of phenomena that have as a primary characteristic a ongoingness in reality. We're going back just a step, right?
Yes.
You're a child of your parents, and your parents are a child of and you go back to like pre-humans, you go back biological evolution. And I think you can go back even further than biological evolution, but certainly biological evolution. And in the process, there's been a lot of learning about what kinds of things tend to orient towards the ongoingness and what kinds of things tend not to orient towards ongoingness. And so there's something, the wisdom of that is a very powerful substrate. This, by the way, is another way of saying relevance realization. And when John V says relevance realization, he's saying, hey, use the wisdom of many billions of years of not fucking everything up to guide you in making choices that are effective. And also, by the way, consciousness, right? What we're doing right now is the edge, right? It's the kind of like the nib of the pen on the paper is, hey, and we are unique in that lineage in having this particular capacity to perceive reality, to think about reality, to communicate with other things that can perceive and think about reality, and to generate something that is sort of new in the world and has even more capacity. And of course, even more capacity to fuck things up. So, okay, we've got to be careful about that. Right. And there's something about the, how do we form that multiplicity that you were describing earlier? Like just that, how do we actually form that, where that felt sense of alienation, or the felt sense of defection, which are mirror images of each other, don't happen. And for us to form the multiplicity where we all are actually not just comfortable in our own anonymity, but also, in fact, actually, what are the conditions that give rise to that multiplicity in the first place? I've called this variously over time, effective collective intelligence, coherent collective intelligence, coherence in and of itself, the Holy Spirit, right? There's lots of different names.
I like that one.
I like that one too. It has a nice like ring to it. But what are the characteristics that consistently and with integrity give rise to the spirit, such that it is the spirit that is creating the thing, and we are merely the vessels and agents and instruments of it,
Exactly.
not the institutions, but the instruments of it, even in ourselves.
Mhm.
In that context, if we learn how to do that and we say, okay, that's just the nature of how reality works, we're just doing the thing that it does. One, I would propose analytically, I can prove this is nice for the ego. Hey, ego, by the way, I can analytically prove that's the way we get out of the trouble that we're in.
Yep.
That's the mechanism whereby we collectively develop the capacity to generate enough collective sovereignty that can respond to the context that we're in, such that we can not kill everything and we can live in peace together ongoingly.
Right.
And also it has all the design characteristics that we're talking about. And there will be no alienation in that space. There will be no defection in that space.
Right.
It's a very specific location in what
Right.
Greg would call culture space or
Right.
systems of justification space.
Right. And ultimately, it's something that, even though it's a principle that could be given words to, the embodiment of it is something that is a bit harder to grasp, and something that can only really be sort of put into being by being around it. You know, it's like, yeah, it's like with martial arts. I do martial arts, and there's certain things that, yeah, you could, a really intelligent person could get manuals and try to put it back together. And I think that there's an important thing about that. But to really light up a group of people, to allow them to plug into some sort of stronger energy, it has to be through that sort of embodied relationship, I think. And I mean, even this disconnected virtual experience too, and where it's sort of like a rhythm of openness or freedom, where it's not, I'm trying to distinguish it from something that's more procedural, even though it has certain characteristics that are almost like that. But it's not based in singular actions at all, right? It's the context of acting at all. So that's why this sort of, what I call like an autologicalness, where the self is, you're acting from that centeredness, right? Or there's that connection to the self, or connection to spirit or divine or whatever. It has to be there. It has to already be there for us to dip ourselves into it, or to allow other people to dip into it.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe even the deepest point in the stack. So certainly something that I've learned and have endeavored to do with greater or lesser degrees of success is to have as a fundamental principle: if connected to the infinite, then do more stuff. If not, then stop and go back.
Exactly.